You're in the mountains. Temperature is dropping. Rain is starting. Your synthetic jacket, the one that promised water resistance, temperature regulation, and cutting-edge technology, is now soaking through. You're cold, getting colder, and you're standing in a system that failed you. A medieval peasant in the year 1350 would never know this problem. Not because they had better gear, but because they understood something we've forgotten. The physics of survival require patience, and profit margins require speed. This is the story of wool, a fiber so fundamentally superior in wet, cold conditions that we abandoned it for worse alternatives, and then spent a century convincing ourselves the alternatives were progress. Let's start in the English Cotswolds, 14th century. For a medieval peasant or craftsperson, wool wasn't a luxury. It was architecture, the foundation of winter survival. But to understand why wool worked so well, you need to understand how it was actually processed. Because that process, the one that took months, was the reason it worked. A sheep was sheared once a year. The raw wool, still thick with lanolin and dirt, would arrive at the fuller's workshop. The fuller's job was essential and time-consuming. He would soak the wool in water and urine. Yes, human urine, which contains ammonia and acts as a cleaning agent. Then he would beat it repeatedly, sometimes by hand, sometimes with mallets, sometimes by trampling it in vats. This process, called fulling, could take weeks. What was happening? The fulling process aligned the microscopic scales on each fiber. It closed them down. It bound the fibers tighter together, creating density, creating insulation, creating something that would trap heat even when wet. Then came the dyeing. The wool would be immersed in vats with plant-based dyes, woad for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow. These weren't quick baths. They were weeks-long processes. The dye would bond to the fiber at a molecular level, not sitting on the surface like modern synthetic dyes, living within the fiber itself. What the medieval clothmaker understood was this: durability came from time, quality came from process, and the process came from working within the limits of nature, not against them. Wool garments made in 1350 often survived generations. They were darned, patched, rewoven. A single wool cloak might clothe 5 different people across 50 years. Archaeological evidence shows us this. Fragments of medieval wool textiles survive in bogs, in graves, in monasteries. Intact, wearable, some over 600 years old. Think about that. A piece of clothing lasting 6 centuries. And it wasn't made by machines. It wasn't made in a factory. It was made by hand, by people who understood the material so deeply that they could coax it into performing at levels we still struggle to match. The medieval full-body layering system was also revolutionary in its understanding. A peasant in winter didn't own a single heavy coat. They wore layers. A linen shirt. Linen against the skin pulls moisture away from the body. Then a wool tunic. Then another wool layer. Sometimes sheepskin. The medieval body wasn't trying to stay dry. It was trying to stay warm while managing moisture, accepting that wetness happens, and building a system around that fact. This wasn't ignorance. This was engineering born from consequence. When there's no electric heater waiting for you, when you have to work outside in November, when hypothermia is a genuine risk, you develop systems that work, that survive. Now skip forward to today. We have synthetic fibers. We have Gore-Tex. We have Thinsulate. We have water-resistant coatings and moisture-wicking technology and marketing that promises revolutionary performance. We have spent 70 years and billions of dollars developing alternatives to wool. Here's what we actually have: clothing that works beautifully in controlled conditions. In theory, in the marketing shoot, in the first season. But take that synthetic jacket into a wet, cold scenario. Actually wet, actually cold, actually far from a home dryer, and something happens. Polyester holds moisture. It absorbs it. That moisture sits against your skin or trapped in the insulation layers, leaching heat. The synthetic insulation, whether it's polyester, nylon, or acrylic, loses roughly 70% of its insulating ability when saturated. Not gradually, precipitously. You notice it within minutes. The modern synthetic garment is built around a false assumption. You will dry it quickly. You will put it in a machine. You will apply heat. You will restore it to factory condition. The entire design philosophy depends on access to infrastructure that is barely 100 years old. Take that same person and put them in a medieval wool cloak. Wool contains lanolin, natural oil from the sheep. That oil is hydrophobic. It repels water at a level that synthetic fiber simply cannot match. Studies conducted at the University of Otago in New Zealand measured the insulation value of wool under full saturation. Even soaking wet, wool retained approximately 80% of its insulating ability. Not because the wool stayed completely dry, it didn't, but because the structure of the fiber and the presence of lanolin meant that water didn't penetrate the entire depth of the fabric. Heat was retained in the dense interior. Modern synthetics, by contrast, are designed to be breathable. This marketing term means they allow water vapor to escape. It sounds good. It's actually a design flaw in wet conditions. Because water vapor from your body escapes easily, yes, but so does external moisture absorption faster. And once saturated, there's no lanolin to slow the heat loss. The entire system fails. But this raises a question that nobody asks out loud. If we knew this about wool in 1350, and we know it now in 2026, why did we replace it? What changed? The answer isn't that synthetics are better. The answer is that they're cheaper to produce at scale, and faster, and more compatible with industrial manufacturing and global supply chains, and more profitable. Here's the moment everything shifted. For roughly 400 years, from about 1200 to 1600, wool was the dominant fiber in Europe. Quality varied, of course, but the system was consistent. Fulling mills existed everywhere. Dyers knew the craft. Tailors understood the material. And because of that understanding, medieval and Renaissance garments often outlasted the people who wore them. Then came two things at almost the same moment: the Industrial Revolution and the invention of synthetic dyes. In the 1870s, chemists created aniline dyes, synthetic colors that were brighter, cheaper, and faster to apply than natural dyes. By the 1920s, you had nylon. By the 1950s, you had polyester. Suddenly, you could make a garment in days instead of months. You could dye it in hours instead of weeks. You could sell it cheaper. You could sell more of it. You could plan on it failing so you could sell another one. Wool is incompatible with that system. Fulling takes time. Wool doesn't respond well to chemical speed up. Hand dyeing with wool and natural dyes creates variation, and variation is a problem for industrial uniformity. Medieval wool production was designed around limitation. You made what you needed. You made it well. You made it last. Synthetic fiber was designed around excess. Make more. Make cheaper. Assume replacement. And build the entire consumer expectation around that assumption. This is the turn. This is the moment you understand that we didn't abandon wool because it failed. We abandoned it because it succeeded too well. It was too durable, too consistent, too independent of industrial supply chains. A medieval wool cloak didn't need a factory to be maintained. It needed skill, and skill can't be industrialized at scale. To understand why wool is superior, you have to understand the actual physics happening at the fiber level. Wool fiber has a scale structure. Imagine shingles on a roof, all overlapping in one direction. When that scale structure is closed tight, through proper fulling and processing, water beads on the surface rather than being absorbed. The fiber itself is hydrophobic due to lanolin content, which modern processing often strips out, but was maintained in historical practice. And crucially, the protein structure of keratin, the actual molecule wool is made of, can hold heat even when water is present. Polyester, by contrast, is a synthetic polymer with a completely different molecular structure. It's smooth. Water penetrates the fiber itself, not just sitting on the surface. And once that fiber is saturated, there's no lanolin, no hydrophobic property to slow heat loss. The water conducts heat away from the body more efficiently than air can conduct it. You cool down faster. This has been measured. Peer-reviewed studies from textile science departments show this consistently. A wool garment at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, while soaking wet, will maintain body heat better than a synthetic insulated jacket at the same temperature while soaking wet. Not slightly better. Measurably, significantly better. But here's where it gets interesting. The medieval fuller understood this without measuring it. They understood it through the practice of the craft. A fuller who didn't fully his wool properly would hear about it when the garment failed. When the buyer came back in winter complaining of cold, feedback was immediate and personal. Accountability was built in. Modern manufacturing has none of this. A company can sell a jacket that fails in real conditions and face no direct consequence because the consumer assumes the failure is their fault. They didn't dry it properly. They didn't treat it right. The garment couldn't possibly be poorly designed. It says advanced technology on the tag. Now, let's talk about odor. This is where wool reveals something almost miraculous. Wool's scales and lanolin content create an environment hostile to bacteria. Bacteria causes odor. Wool doesn't require washing after every wear because it resists bacterial growth naturally. Medieval people washed their wool garments perhaps once a season, and those garments lasted decades. Modern synthetic clothing holds odor permanently. Polyester, nylon, acrylic, they absorb and trap odor-causing bacteria in ways wool never does. Which is why synthetic base layers start smelling after a single wear and why you have to wash them constantly. Which degrades the synthetic fibers faster, which means you replace them sooner, which is exactly what the manufacturer profits from. There's also the matter of durability under stress. Wool is naturally elastic. The keratin protein has a coil structure that allows it to stretch and return. Medieval wool garments stretched with movement and returned to shape. They could be worn hard for years. Synthetics are less elastic. They pill, they tear. The fibers break down under stress. And once they start pilling or tearing, there's no easy repair. You can't darn polyester the way you can darn wool. Medieval households had baskets of scraps, leftover wool from cutting and sewing projects. These scraps were unraveled and respun into yarn for darning. A hole in a wool garment was a 10-minute repair, not a discarding event. Consider also the end-of-life scenario. Medieval wool, when it finally wore out, decomposed. It went into the soil as nitrogen-rich organic material, enriching the earth. Synthetic fiber doesn't decompose. It fragments. Microplastics. They enter the water system. They enter the food chain. We're finding them in human blood now. The medieval peasant owned perhaps 3 wool garments in their entire life. One for work, one for better occasions, one for winter. That's it. They were mended constantly. They were handed down. They were remade. And when they finally disintegrated, they returned to the earth. A modern person will own dozens of synthetic jackets in their lifetime, each one lasting a few years before pilling, fading, or sustaining damage that makes replacement seem easier than repair. And each one persisting in the environment for centuries, breaking into fragments that will outlast all of us. The shift away from wool happened in stages, and understanding those stages shows you something crucial about how systems change. First came the synthetic dyes in the late 1800s. This made color faster and cheaper. Wool producers adapted. Wool continued to dominate. But the foundation was laid for something else, the idea that you could improve on natural processes through chemistry. Then came World War II. Nylon was invented as a synthetic replacement for silk. Silk production was disrupted by the war, and the military needed parachutes. Nylon filled that need and proved that you could manufacture synthetic fiber at scale. That's the key moment, not the invention itself, the proof of scale. After the war, there was a cultural moment where synthetic became synonymous with modern, and modern became synonymous with better. Plastic was futuristic. Polyester was a wonder fabric. The idea that you could make something entirely new, entirely designed rather than grown, became a sign of progress. Medieval will suddenly seem backward not because it performed poorly, but because it wasn't synthetic. Marketing played a crucial role. By the 1960s and 70s, the synthetic fiber industry was spending millions to convince consumers that polyester was superior. Easy care, no wrinkles, machine washable. These aren't actually advantages if the garment survives better without those properties. But they're advantages if you're trying to convince someone to replace their wool regularly. The final push came with globalization and the search for absolute cost reduction. Wool farming is land-intensive. Sheep require care. Wool processing requires skill and time. Synthetic production requires petroleum, chemicals, and factories. As long as oil was cheap and labor could be pushed to the lowest wage regions, synthetics won on price. But price isn't value. A wool cloak that lasts 50 years is cheaper per year than a synthetic jacket that lasts 5 years, even if the synthetic jacket costs a third as much upfront. That math doesn't appear in a store price tag. So we abandoned a material that worked because it didn't fit into an economic system designed around disposability and rapid replacement. Not because we found something better, because we found something faster and cheaper to manufacture. If you're going to engage with this knowledge, there are 3 practical paths forward. First, return to wool intentionally. This doesn't mean medieval reenactment. It means understanding that if you're investing in winter clothing, a quality merino wool layer is still the most reliable foundation for wet, cold conditions. Buy wool from ethical sources. Patagonia, Smart Wool, and other brands now produce merino wool with responsible farming practices. One good wool garment will outlast 3 synthetic alternatives. The cost per wear becomes lower. The performance is higher. And at end of life, the material biodegrades. Second, understand the hybrid approach. You don't have to live in medieval clothes, but you can use wool as a base layer and mid-layer, where the benefits are most dramatic, and use synthetics elsewhere. Wool under a water-resistant outer shell will keep you warm and managing moisture better than synthetic under synthetic. The key is knowing what each layer does and why. Third, stop trusting marketing language about synthetic materials. Moisture wicking means water moves through the fiber. In dry conditions, that's good. In actually wet conditions, rain, snow, submersion, that's a liability. Waterproof usually means water-resistant for a limited time with a coating that degrades. Advanced technology usually means optimized for low manufacturing cost. Read the actual performance specs. Look for peer-reviewed textile studies. Ask people who use the gear in actual harsh conditions, not influencers who use it in the sun for 30 seconds. The meta principle here is this: durability requires time. Quality requires process. And both of those things are incompatible with industrial scale and profit maximization. You have to choose. You can't have both. When a company promises durability and cheap price and fast replacement, they're lying. Something has to give. We tell ourselves a story about progress. That story says the past was primitive and uncomfortable, that the medieval persons suffered needlessly, that modern technology solved their problems, that we, living now, are the pinnacle of human well-being. But step into a medieval wool cloak in November rain, and you discover something uncomfortable. It works better than most of what we made to replace it. Not because medieval people were geniuses, but because they had to face the direct consequences of their choices. A garment that failed meant cold. Cold meant death. So they didn't make garments that failed. We live insulated from those consequences. Failure is replaced quickly. We buy another jacket. We throw the broken one away. The person whose labor extracted and processed the materials never sees our complaint. The ecosystem that will absorb the microplastics will never send us a bill. What the medieval full-time craftsperson understood was that materials have limits. That working within limits creates quality. That time spent creates durability. That the goal isn't to beat the material, it's to work with it. This wasn't romantic. It wasn't noble. It was practical. It was the result of living inside the constraints that materials impose. We spent a century convincing ourselves that we'd transcended those constraints, that we'd invented better, that synthetic fiber was an improvement over natural fiber. But we measured improvement by the wrong metrics. We measured by speed and cost. We didn't measure by durability. We didn't measure by real-world performance in actual harsh conditions. We didn't measure by end-of-life impact. We didn't measure by whether the person wearing the garment could repair it with simple tools and local knowledge. By those metrics, we didn't improve. We traded one set of advantages for a different set of disadvantages. And because the disadvantages, disposability, constant replacement, microplastic pollution, are distributed across time and geography, we don't see them as failures. We see them as normal. But standing in the rain in a worn synthetic jacket that no longer insulates, wondering why your winter gear fails where a medieval person succeeded, you confront a question that doesn't have a comfortable answer. What did we think we were improving? This knowledge, the knowledge that wool works, that medieval processing created durability, that we abandoned the better option for the cheaper option, this knowledge was never lost. It was ignored, systematically, by design. There are still fullers in Scotland. There are still natural dyers. There are still people who understand wool at the fiber level. They've been waiting. The medieval monks kept the craft alive. The textile schools never entirely abandoned it. The knowledge was preserved by people who understood that some technologies don't get better. They just get cheaper. If you're interested in recovering some of that buried knowledge, in clothing, in food systems, in how humans can live with intention inside natural limits rather than against them, there are people showing the way, rediscovering it, teaching it, building it back into systems that had been stripped away. That's what we'll explore in the next video. For now, The next time you're cold and wet in synthetic gear that's failing, think about the medieval peasant in wool. Not with nostalgia, with curiosity, with the question, what did they understand that we forgot?